America in Uproar, the Vietnam War protests.
The Vietnam War was a bloody conflict between Communist North Vietnam and Democratic South Vietnam, along with its main ally, the United States of America. The conflict was present as early as 1945 when the North took control of the northern city of Hanoi. Active U.S. involvement began in 1954. The fighting was intensified by the ongoing Cold War with the Communist Soviet Union, a supporter of the North, along with the idea that a domino effect of communism could take place in Southeast Asia. In August 1964, 2 U.S. destroyers were attacked by Northern torpedo boats, which prompted the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Johnson broad war-making power. There were 175,000 troops in Vietnam by the end of 1965, and the number only kept increasing. However, distrust began to brew among the soldiers and American people behind the reasoning for the war.
Protests started small on collegiate campuses, but by 1965 were of national importance. The leftist organization, Students for Democratic Society, or SDS, organized many protests and teach-ins where they educated people about their reasons for opposition. Liberals, hippies, some celebrities, and artists were all part of the movement. Artists organized their own protests too, including those at UCLA in the 1970 New York art strike. About 503,000 soldiers deserted, and another 500,000 U.S. men fled to Canada to avoid conscription. Others acted out and returned their draft cards or destroyed them. Muhammad Ali, a famous boxer, resisted being drafted as well. Jane Fonda, a popular film actress, was an activist who received backlash, and to this day still does, for her disrespectful involvement during the war.
On October 21, 1967, 100,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., and a fraction marched on towards the Pentagon. Organized by the Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, the protesters' main objective was to gain national visibility, but another scheme being plotted by some was to storm the Pentagon. They illegally gathered since they couldn't get a permit. This was a significant moment for the anti-war movement. Chants such as, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" and "Hell no, we won't go," were taken up by the crowd. The Youth International Party, or Yippies, was responsible for many threats to storm the Pentagon. In the early morning, there were speeches, signs, and an anti-draft rally at the Lincoln Memorial. Around 5:40 p.m., around 35,000 to 50,000 people stormed the Pentagon. About 10 made it inside the Pentagon, only to be quickly removed. Military police and deputy marshals were the main control of the protests, which had become riots. They faced their own dilemma. Many of the military were drafted, and the deputy marshals were civilians just like the protesters. Some sympathized with the cause, torn between duty and belief. A couple abandoned their posts and sided with the crowd or got dismissed by their superiors for showing support.
Vegetables, rocks, and bottles were turned into weapons. Tear gas was let loose, leaving 47 injured, while 682 were arrested. The second day of protests was more peaceful, consisting of mainly sit-ins. North Vietnamese flags were waved by a couple of protesters, and this apparent support of the enemy was not taken kindly. Public opinion of the protests was not favorable, according to the news sources from the time, and the movement was seen as radical and disloyal. They were not taken seriously. One army officer was not very pleased to see what seemed to be complete disrespect for their lives and service. Ironically, George Kirby, a Marine on weekend leave, met protesters who meant no harm to soldiers. In the end, the intended effect of national coverage was achieved. Both sides were severely divided. Those who were anti-war were called traitors, and those who were pro-war were called fascist. Also, in 1967, the civil rights icon, Martin Luther King Jr., denounced the war, stating it was a blasphemy against all America stands for. He noted the disproportionate amount of African American casualties.
One thing that provoked outrage was the number of civilian casualties. More than half of the total 3 million dead were Vietnamese civilians. Events such as the My Lai massacre, where an entire civilian village was murdered for no real reason, would come to light, leading to even more anger. After a surprise attack in 1968, the Tet Offensive, by the North Vietnamese, Johnson's approval rating plummeted, therefore resulting in him trying to put a more peaceful approach forward. Protests reached their peak since it became clear that victory was nowhere near like the government had promised. The Democratic president did not seek re-election. At the Democratic National Convention, 10,000 protesters gathered and fought against security. A group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, or VVAW, joined in on protest.
Bob Steele died for these medals. Lieutenant Paverell died so I got a medal. Sergeant John died so I got a medal. I got a Silver Star, Purple Heart, Army Commendation Medal, 8 Air Medals, National Defense, and the rest of this garbage. It doesn't mean a thing.
That year, Nixon won the presidency. He withdrew U.S. troops, increased bombing, provided resources to the South, and attempted peace talks. On November 15, 1969, 500,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C., the largest anti-war protest in American history, and called for the removal of American troops, which Nixon failed to do until many months into his presidency. The protest was remembered for its size, and also the fact that middle-aged participants were among the crowd in larger numbers. The South Vietnamese and the U.S. invaded Cambodia, causing the South to invade Laos in hopes of cutting off northern Vietnamese supplies. This was a violation of international law and led to even more protests, some of which turned deadly. National Guardsmen killed 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio on May 4, 1970. 4 million students in high schools and colleges nationwide went on strike as well.
The Pentagon Papers, which contained confidential information about the war that revealed many of the nation's secret deeds in Southeast Asia, were leaked in 1971, prompting questioning by the American people. The leaking of the papers, in its own way, was a form of communication. Drafting for the war was ended in 1972 by Nixon. In January 1973, the U.S. and Northern Vietnam came to a peace agreement, ending open hostilities and decades-long U.S. involvement, and the Paris Peace Agreement was signed on January 27, 1973. The North and South continued to fight up until the North conquered the southern capital of Saigon in 1975, ending the war and birthing the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Growing public resentment to the war, largely caused by the protests, had forced Nixon to leave it.
From the beginning, starting with the teach-ins, to protests and speeches, the anti-war movement used communication to carry it forward. Posters advertised protests, the news televised their cause, and protests could be assembled in weeks. The movement had achieved its goal. Without communication, it was deemed to fail. Without the opposition, the country may have been wrapped up in that war for much longer, with many more dollars spent and many more lives lost. Because of the growing public anti-war sentiment, Nixon decided to end the war. American pop culture was also influenced with anti-war songs, rock music, films, and more. The protests organized during this time were some of the largest in U.S. history. One of the longest-lasting legacies of the movement, however, was a skepticism of the government that still lasts to this day. Events such as My Lai were kept under wraps for years, and the Pentagon Papers proved that the officials were lying. When President Bush announced the war in Iraq, the nation was once again divided like during Vietnam. The effects of the war lasted much longer than 1973, though. 58,000 American troops were left dead. In addition to the $120 billion dent left in America's pocket, the people were divided between those in support and those against the nation's involvement for years to come.